Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of At War, a podcast by the CLC. Thank you to everyone for tuning in to our last episode on Biden's foreign policy. Today, we're going to be talking about the Afghan peace process, and our guest is Fahd Humayun. Fahd is a fifth-year Ph.D. candidate in political science at Yale University, where his research centers on questions of democratic institutionalization and state behavior. In addition to writing regularly for the News International, his commentary on Pakistan and the region has appeared in Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera, Arab News, The Wire, and Dawn. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start off by asking you to give us like a little brief rejoinder for our viewers. As someone who's been so consistently familiar with the region, can you give us the briefest background to the peace agreement that was signed between the US and the Taliban in February 2020 and the increasing tensions that have coincided with the arrival of the Biden administration?
Sure. So just in terms of how you framed that, the deal that was struck between the United States and the Taliban back in February 2020 was the result of a belated realization on the part of the Americans that there had to be some sort of political negotiation to end this long conflict. This has officially become America's longest war in terms of how long it's lasted for. It's exceeded America's involvement in Vietnam. It's cost the United States more than the Marshall Plan that was put in place after the Second World War. And when I say there was this belated realization that the Taliban couldn't be defeated militarily, this realization came on the heels of several attempts by different presidents to try and, in some ways, stem the bleed in Afghanistan. Famously in 2009, President Obama attempted a surge where an additional 33,000 troops were deployed in Afghanistan to try and defeat the Taliban. There were several flaws with the Obama administration's counterterrorism approach towards the region. One of them was that it sort of overlooked the dysfunction of the Afghan administration and the fact that this was an administration that wasn't viewed as credible or legitimate within Afghanistan. I think another problem was the fact that when they surged troops on the ground, they also announced very fixed timelines for when these troops would withdraw. So in some ways, it was just a matter, it was just for the Taliban to sort of bide their time. Throughout this sort of period that we're discussing, Pakistan maintained that there could be no sort of military solution to the Afghan problem, and there had to be a political settlement. And so it was a combination of, I think, Pakistan sort of constantly trying to convey this message that the Taliban need to be negotiated with. They're a political reality. That when the Trump administration came in, it was during the Trump presidency that Zalmay Khalilzad was appointed as the special envoy to the region. And these efforts then began to try and bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. So in 2018, that's when the United States and the Taliban actually began high-level, direct face-to-face negotiations. It was, so when we're talking about the deal that was struck in 2020, it's important to sort of have this context in mind that initially the United States was very reluctant, dragging its feet, played a spoiler on many occasions at various points in which a peace might have been achievable had it not sort of adopted this dual fight-talk strategy beforehand. And it's also worth mentioning that I think after 2018, you also saw a considerable effort by Pakistan to try and make peace happen. So I think, just to give you an example, every time Zalmay Khalilzad came to the region, there was at least one visit to Islamabad. So it's clear that Pakistan was doing a lot to try and facilitate and make this happen. Pakistan also in 2018 released Mullah Ghani Baradar, who has now become one of the chief Taliban interlocutors, who's negotiating with the Afghan government in Doha. So just to put that sort of perspective there, since then, the deal that was signed in February was meant to be the first of a two-part deal with the Taliban. So the first part was that the United States sort of signs a deal, gets the Taliban to agree to talk to the Afghan government. And in doing so, what the United States sort of stipulated was that they would leave Afghanistan by the 1st of May 2021, which is a month and a half's time. Since then, though, things have sort of been at an impasse. And there are issues, there are roadblocks that are sort of cropping up in the conversation that's taking place between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And there are several reasons for why these complications are sort of have sort of arisen. I think one is that the United States has signaled that it might renege on the May 1st deadline, which means that it will extend the date the duration for its footprint to remain in Afghanistan. The United States, for its part, argues that the Taliban haven't kept up their end of the bargain, that there hasn't been a reduction in violence, that there continue to be terrorist attacks, bomb blasts in Afghanistan that target Afghan institutions, Afghan civilians. So the last 3 months of 2020 were, I think they saw a 45% increase in casualties compared to the same period the previous year. So that's sort of where the United States is coming from. With the advent of a Biden administration, we've had senior US officials, Anthony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, sort of talking about how it's necessary to review the deal that was inked under the Trump administration. I think one of the good things that the new Biden administration has done is they've retained Zalmay Khalilzad to continue on in that role as special envoy, because I think what is one of the few things that can help this situation move along is trust. So yeah, I think we can sort of like use that as an opening ground.
Yeah, no, definitely. It was interesting for me when I was reading the agreement, because I just saw it as a complete capitulation on the part of the American government, because what they've done is said, okay, we'll completely withdraw. We're going to take you guys off the sanctions list. We're going to have this prisoner exchange, no involvement from the Afghan government in the treaty, but you've agreed on their behalf to have this prisoner exchange. And at the same time, all you've managed to get from the Taliban is promises of a ceasefire, promises that you kind of are very wary about their ability to keep. And I wanted to talk a little bit as well about Pakistan's role in that, because Pakistan was incredibly vindicated from the agreement, right? Because it was a win-win for them. They've long been saying that we're going to have this, that this is the only solution. We're going to have a diplomatic solution. And it's really continued to emphasize that its key role has been in bringing the Afghan Taliban to the table for a negotiated settlement. And as the American withdrawal picks up pace, do you think that the Afghan government will continue to be viewed as a credible negotiating partner to this?
So I think there are a couple of things in what you've asked. So there's the one question has to do with how Pakistan was sort of scapegoated for taking a certain policy and approach and insisting that there should be a political settlement and a military sort of solution to the end game in Afghanistan is just not tenable. And then there's a secondary issue of the solvency and the credibility of the current Ghani administration. But let me actually sort of picking up on, in trying to answer both, let me also sort of like take us back to 2001, which is when the United States invaded Afghanistan. So we know that after 9/11, the United States invaded Afghanistan on the pretext of sort of taking out Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
And when they did so, they also bombed, Taliban targets. They one of the admissions, in fact, that many American commentators now make is that the United States in 2001 should have drawn a starker distinction between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. For a number of reasons, a withdrawal of international support. The Taliban regime fell very quickly in 2001. And it was in November of 2001 that the Bonn Conference was held in Germany, which brought factions to the table, but not the Taliban.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it can't even be called a peace process because the participants of the Bonn Conference weren't warring factions. And now there's evidence to suggest that at the time there were Taliban leaders who actually had been sympathetic to compromising and who had wanted to be part of that post-war settlement. I think that's where this issue of the erosion of the legitimacy of subsequent Afghan administrations began to take effect, because it was not just an issue of these governments being mired by corruption, allegations of misspending the billions of dollars that donors were sending into the country, but also I think a very real issue that we don't sort of pay enough attention to is the fact that these governments, if you look at the Karzai government or the Ashraf Ghani government, these have been seen as unrepresentative of the aspirations of the Afghan people. And that sort of leads us to where the current stalemate is between the Afghan government and led by President Ashraf Ghani on the one hand, and the Afghan Taliban. So the United States under Anthony Blinken has put forward this sort of Afghanistan peace agreement plan, which is calling for an interim government that is comprised of all sides, including the Taliban. And if you look at the text of that plan, there are sort of these key blank spaces in it, which can be filled in on at a later date about which how is the pie sort of divided, which side gets what in terms of dividing ministries, allocation of in particular the security sector, who's in charge of the security sector. President Ashraf Ghani has rejected that sort of peace plan and has said that instead offered that there can be early elections in which everyone votes, but that is conditional on on a Taliban ceasefire first. On the part of the Afghan government, there seems to be this very palpable reluctance to relinquish power for understandable reasons, because there are a number of power centers that are currently outside of the Ghani administration, which would gain considerably, warlords who would gain considerably by from an interim sort of framework. So I think there's this real issue at the heart of where the current negotiation is stuck between Kabul and the Taliban, in terms of whether to move towards an interim settlement or whether to move towards what Ghani is calling for, and what a plan which I believe he's hoping to present in Istanbul in a few weeks' time, calling for early elections, which I think there's a lot of skepticism that should the plan B be followed, those early elections might not happen. So to answer you the second part of your question about the extent to which the Afghan government can continue to be seen as a credible partner, has a lot to do with, I think, the concessions that it's willing to make in terms of how it negotiates in the next couple of weeks. So there are senior officials in the Afghan government who have taken very badly to the tone of Anthony Blinken's letter, in which they've said that Afghanistan cannot be dictated to like this. They've not appreciated the language that's been used.
Right.
And I think if you look at the United States now, the United States is keen to sort of retreat from Afghanistan. When the Obama administration pledged to surge troops, we know that Joe Biden, who was his vice president then, was one of the advisors who was against the idea of surging troops, and was in fact more inclined towards a withdrawal of forces. I think if you look at public opinion polls in the US, there's growing indifference towards the Afghan war. It was in 2003. It was in 2003, 2004, at the time when the United States had began shifting focus towards Iraq, that Afghanistan began to be labeled America's forgotten war. And I think there's a real problem now, which is that even though it's become America's longest war, the desire to stay and see things through in a dignified manner has diminished significantly. So there are many things which I'm sure the US would like to do, but it's really a question of doing sort of deciding between what's doable versus what's desirable at this point. And when you said that one of the things that the United States did was, it capitulated in the form of that February 2020 agreement, I think it's symptomatic of just that, that fatigue and that desire to sort of exit quickly.
Yeah.
I think one of the most damaging things, the February 2020 agreement did some good things. It got the Taliban to agree to reduce violence, but I think one of the damaging things that it did was it delegitimized the Kabul government, because it excluded the Ashraf Ghani administration from the process. And I think the Ghani administration has had a hard time stomaching that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting to note that Biden's policy kind of seems to be a little bit of a continuation of Obama's, because he then started off by emphasizing this counterterrorism plus, that, we will withdraw, but we'll keep their little counterterrorism force, So we're not going to have a large ground troop involvement, but we're going to have, this little strategically deployed force and some air power. And I found Blinken's letter quite interesting as well, because it focused on the regional countries that are involved. So it mentioned India, it mentioned Pakistan. And then I kind of want to talk about the Afghan government and the Taliban in my next question. But first, I wanted to ask you about the Washington narrative about Pakistan and whether that still continues. So we saw that in his recently published memoirs, Trump's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, he said that Pakistan shouldn't do more, it should do less. And by doing less, he meant support the Haqqani network less, support the insurgency less. So are we finally seeing a shift away from this narrative, even though some people still criticize Pakistan for, continuing to do stuff that it shouldn't do?
Yeah. Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that if you look at the extent of America's involvement in Afghanistan, 2/3 of that, of those 2 decades were spent sort of telling Pakistan to do more. Do more in sort of fighting the Taliban, do more in, trying to facilitate an end game, which was essentially of America's own making. I would sort of argue here, though, that, the reason why the Taliban came to the table in February 2020 was not because Pakistan did less. It was because Pakistan actually played a considerable part in making that happen. If Pakistan had done less, I highly doubt that the February 2020 agreement would have happened. So that's where I would differ with McMaster's thesis on this. Going back to what I said about 2018, the release of Mullah Ghani Brother by Pakistan, it took 9 rounds of negotiations after that for the Taliban to finally come to the table in Doha and sign an agreement with the United States. Pakistan's foreign minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi was at the signing of the Doha agreement. So I think there's a symbolic angle to that, but I think in substantive terms, Pakistan did pull considerable weight and continues to do so. I mean, we talked about how Zalmay Khalilzad has been stopping over in Islamabad every time he's come to the region. It's also worth mentioning that the peace process uh, doesn't the sort of didn't begin in 2018. So let's go back further a few years. As early as 2015, Pakistan was hosting Murray-like peace processes, trying to get the Taliban to the table. Interestingly, with Americans present at the venue, but sitting in the next room. So you can sort of tell that the Americans are still dragging their feet, still following this fight modality, not fully convinced of the utility of talking to the Taliban. I think there were, in fact, two incidents that come to mind. One was when Pakistan hosted the Taliban, including the Haqqanis, at Murray to try and get them to negotiate an end to the war. It was around that time that the United States leaked news of Mullah Umar's death. And that scuttled the peace process, because for a number of reasons it led to all kinds of speculation. It signaled a lack of trust in the peace process on behalf of the United States. There was a second incident in which the United States is believed to have played a spoiler role in the peace process. So this is when the Quad framework was in place. So Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, and the United States were all trying to get the Taliban to again see, how can we sort of build a credible framework to go forward. And the United States took out the leader of the Taliban, Mullah Akhtar Mansour, in a drone strike, again bringing the peace process to a screeching halt. So on both of those instances, Pakistan felt let down, because Pakistan had been investing considerable resource into trying to facilitate an end to the conflict. But also I think there has been this growing fatigue in Pakistan, particularly over the last decade, in which Pakistan is just fed up of being viewed by the United States through this purely Afghan centric prism. Right. So every conversation that Pakistan has with the United States begins with and ends with Afghanistan. Right? What is Pakistan doing to facilitate an endgame? What should Pakistan, like you said, be doing more of or doing less of? I think in the interest of sort of getting out of that very toxic kind of place where Pakistan is constantly being criticized for everything that goes wrong in Afghanistan, and then being told to step up and do more. Pakistan has tried very hard to bring the conflict in Afghanistan to a dignified close, because Pakistan also wants to move beyond Afghanistan. Pakistan is tired of sort of being seen as being conjoined at the hip with Afghanistan. The entire rationale behind building a fence between the two countries along the 2,400 kilometer border is precisely that, to try and sort of what happens in Afghanistan needs to stay in Afghanistan, what happens in Pakistan needs to stay in Pakistan. This is a big shift from Pakistan's previous policy of trying to maintain strategic depth in Afghanistan. That's a policy which I think has very few buyers in Pakistan right now. So going forward, if Pakistan wants to focus on a foreign policy that's predicated in geoeconomics, regional connectivity, good ties with neighbors, be it east or west, the first thing that has to happen is there has to be peace in the region. And that's really where Pakistan has been coming from during all of this. So I think the danger now is that as we sort of look at the current impasse between the Afghan government and the Taliban in Doha, there is this concern in Pakistan that once again, should the United States renege on the May 1st deadline and choose to stay in Afghanistan for longer than that, the Taliban are obviously not going to take kindly to this. When that happens and things start going south, Pakistan's biggest concern is that it's going to end up getting scapegoated, as has happened in the past. I think that's the real concern that Pakistan has right now, which is why Pakistan is very keen to see the peace process in Afghanistan go ahead. I think on its, for its part, the United States and some observers who look at Afghanistan, they criticize Pakistan for having brought the Taliban to the table in February 2020, but then for not having done enough to actually get them to agree to reduce violence or to agree to a ceasefire. And I think that's really the rub here, because there are obvious limits to what Pakistan can do. Pakistan can't go into the negotiating room in Doha to argue on behalf or act as a third party in those discussions. I think everybody has made it very clear that for these negotiations to be successful, they have to be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. And for that, the real sort of legwork now has to be done by the parties that are in the room, which is the Afghan government, which needs to actually figure out, what it's negotiating for, and the Taliban. Recently, a commentator I think this was a Western commentator, observed that one of the problems that exist at the moment is that both sides, so the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government, have actually been hounded to the table. Neither side actually believes that they've exhausted military options. So both of them feel as if they've been coerced into sitting down and talking to each other. And that's a real problem, because that means that if you try and unpack the incentives of each actor, neither of them really has to be at the negotiating table, right? They always have the ability, or they believe they have the ability to walk away without penalty. And so that's, again, something which I think is a function of how the sequencing of these agreements has taken place. The February agreement between the US and the Taliban, which cut Kabul out of the conversation. And now this expectation that Ashraf Ghani is going to fall into step with the United States' plans to exit and agree to some kind of power sharing deal with the Taliban.
And I find that Pakistan has had to also take a very confused stance as well, because you were talking about Baradar, and we had to add him back to the sanction list, actually, I think very recently in January, because we were so scared of being grey-listed by FATF. And so at the same time, that person is, the Taliban's chief negotiating partner and has legitimacy on that basis, and then we're forced to sanction him on the basis of sanction lists which have not been updated following the peace agreement. And I wanted to talk more about the fencing that you were talking about as well. So insurgent groups hostile to the state of Pakistan are regrouping again in the northwest. So how detrimental do you think that would be to Pakistan's security situation? And has anything really changed in the region after kinetic operations in the tribal areas? And has fencing played any large role in this change? I like to call the fence between Afghanistan and Pakistan our version of Trump's wall, and especially because it's such a porous and frequently traversed border, and you're talking about a border which goes back hundreds of years, that has been used for centuries for people from a region which are so ethnically homogenous as well. So what do you think what are the implications of that?
Again, let me sort of take your question in two parts. So you began with, the blacklists and FATF and talking, which in some ways is connected to the previous question. But just to round off that conversation, the United States has been pushing for a strategy of maximum pressure on Pakistan. So driving up the pressure whenever it believes it can sort of coerce Pakistan into behaving a certain way. Either bringing the Taliban to the table or sort of doing other things that the United States believes is helpful to an endgame that suits Washington. I think that strategy began to change under the Trump administration. For all its faults, one of the better things to come out of the Trump administration was the fact that in 2019, I believe this was early 2019, Senator Lindsey Graham visited Pakistan, actually had very detailed meetings in both Islamabad and Rawalpindi, and saw the extent to which Pakistan had not only rehabilitated its side of the border, but had also decisively, cracked down on terrorism. And also he became aware of the efforts that Pakistan had made up to this point to try and sort of bring about some kind of lasting, viable solution to the Afghan conflict. So he went back. He paved the way for the meeting that eventually happened between President Trump and Prime Minister Imran Khan in Washington, where the two leaders hit it off. And there were a couple of other meetings. One of them was on the sidelines of Davos afterwards. And I think that sort of repair in the relationship was necessary, because what happened, because as a result of that repair, was that both sides, for the first time in a long time, had the same common objective, which was that there needs to be a political settlement to end this war. Up to this point, they had both agreed that the war needs to end, but they had been on different pages about how the war should be brought to a conclusion. So I think the fact that Pakistan has remained on the grey list didn't actually get blacklisted, or the fact that Pakistan during the same period was able to receive an IMF package, also should be seen as fruits of that labor, an improvement in the relationship between Pakistan and the United States, as well as an agreement to not criticize each other as publicly as had been the case in the past. So if you look at the early years of the Trump presidency, you'll remember these nasty tweets that would come out accusing Pakistan of lies and deceit. And towards the end of the Trump presidency, there was a very different, a very measured tone that was used by officials on both sides. And I think for the first time, for the first time today, there's real optimism in terms of salvaging this relationship beyond the rubble of, some half-finished conversation on Afghanistan. So that's in response to the first part of your question. Now coming to the fence, we've already talked about how, this 2,400 kilometer border has been both a blessing and a curse between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So after 9/11, when the Taliban slipped back into the woodwork, they slipped into these caves and underground networks. The West held that the Taliban had retreated into Pakistan and were using Pakistan as a base to regroup and launch attacks in Afghanistan. We also know that in 2007, a number of militant factions that were, inimical to the state of Pakistan converged under the umbrella of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. And under the leadership of Baitullah Masood, they began carrying out large-scale suicide attacks across Pakistani cities. The 2014 attack on the Army Public School in Peshawar, the 2016 Easter Sunday bombing in Lahore. I mean, these are just some of the, in a long chronology of bloody events. These are just some incidents that you and I both remember, because we grew up during this period when Islamabad was branded as unsafe, when Pakistan was branded as not safe for tourists, and Pakistan's image really deteriorated during that time as well. It's for those reasons that and more that Pakistan began a number of kinetic operations, beginning with Zarb-e-Azab in 2014, followed by Radul Fasad, to try and clear up the dismantled terrorist infrastructure on its side of the border, get rid of these groups, because it had become clear that these groups were targeting Pakistan in a way that was not in Pakistan's national interest, was doing a lot of harm to Pakistan's security as well as Pakistan's image abroad. The problem now is that despite a lot of success, so Zarb-e-Azab was a success, Radul Fasad was a success, the erstwhile FATA districts, which have now become part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa proper, are being rehabilitated by the Pakistan military in tandem with civilian agencies. The problem is, though, that by virtue of that border being porous, a lot of these TTP groups that Pakistan chased out ended up finding refuge in eastern Afghanistan, in the bordering provinces of Nangarhar, Paktika, and Kunar, and launching attacks from there into Pakistan. So this has been one of when Pakistan has a conversation with the United States about what needs to be done in the region, what needs to be done in Afghanistan, one of Pakistan's points is like, look, you need to understand what our security concerns are too. There are these groups in eastern Afghanistan that are posing a threat to Pakistan's security, that continue to launch attacks, and Pakistan says it has evidence of foreign agencies sponsoring, nurturing these groups, which are then still being able to launch kinetic attacks into Pakistan cities. In August 2020, I think worryingly, under the leadership of Noor Wali Masood, who's the new TTP commander, a number of disparate factions of the TTP once again coalesced under that same banner. So one of the things that Noor Wali Masood has been able to do is he's been able to bring together, for instance, the Jamaat-ul-Ahrar and the Hizb-ul-Ahrar. Those are two like factions of the TTP that had split following the death of Hakimullah Masood in 2013. And so the Jamaat-ul-Ahrar in particular is known for the Easter Sunday bombing that happened in a few years ago. Its leader, Umar Khalid Khorasani, was recently taken out in Afghanistan. But the fact that they continue to maintain an operational presence means that while their capabilities may have been degraded by numerous military operations conducted by the Pakistan Army, there remains the potential for greater capability if they continue to have a free hand and continue to get sponsorship and continue to sort of operate uninhibited in eastern Afghanistan. So that's really Pakistan's concern. That's sort of where, again, we're talking about the rationale for that, for, like you said, Trump's wall, the 2,400 kilometer border.
Yeah.
I would actually say that, so I would differ a little bit on the reading. So I wouldn't really call it Trump's wall. The new 2,400 kilometer border actually has 16 mandated checkpoints across the border where, people and families who have to cross the border can move. Pakistan and Afghanistan are also at the moment working on establishing trading markets that can exist on either side of the border, as well as discussing long-term passes for families who have both farming land as well as family members on the other side of the border to move more freely. But if in terms of thinking about the damage that the porous border has done in the unchecked flow of, narcotics, goods, narcotics in particular, so we really haven't talked about this, but, opium poppy cultivation, 90% of what is grown in Afghanistan is actually then smuggled out through Pakistan. So there's contraband, there's the illegal trafficking, or the flow of people. And for Pakistan, again, coming back to the TTP, this real concern that groups that are inimical to Pakistan's interests are using eastern Afghanistan to launch attacks into Pakistan. Pakistan wants to prevent that from happening.
I think I think the reason I'm kind of on the other side of this is because I'm thinking about it mainly in the context of refugees. And I was at the Islamabad National Security Dialogue recently, and they talked about anything and everything under the sun that would be a national security issue. And they talked a lot about Afghanistan. There's a lot of talk about the pandemic. There was a lot of talk about climate change. When we're talking about Pak-Afghan relations, we're not talking about refugees. And I think that's I would like to believe that the checkpoints across the Pakistan-Afghan border would be mainly for that, but we also saw that after the APS attack, there was an increased campaign of harassment and intimidation towards refugees, and they were kind of scapegoated at the time for being responsible for these attacks. And I wanted to talk about that because I think it's super important to talk about that in the context of national security and Pak-Afghan relations. So we've always had a Pakistani state policy of repatriation of refugees. Pakistan has said that this cannot be a protracted and never-ending refugee crisis. There is no option of resettlement, right? We have to keep on sending them back. Yeah. And so every time there is an attack, every time we see the issue of refugees being brought to the fore, it's always send them back, send them back, send them back. Shah Mahmood Qureshi, the foreign minister, he released a statement on the day of the Afghan Peace Deal being signed, saying this is a great time for them to be sent back. And so I kind of want to talk about whether a holistic solution would be any likelier given everything that we've talked about. And I also wanted to just bring up here Imran Khan's statement in 2018 that we should give multi-generational refugees, as in the children who are born and raised in Pakistan of Afghan refugee citizenship. There was a very hostile reaction to that statement, and so no further moves have been made on that front. But how likely is it that the Pakistani state is going to continue with this policy of repatriation? I don't really see any change coming there. But also, what is a holistic solution in that? And how should we be talking about refugees in this context?
It's a difficult question. And I think you have done a good job of just identifying all the difficulties associated with the repatriation of refugees. I think one word that Pakistan has been using more frequently is that Pakistan wants a dignified repatriation of refugees. There are a number of sort of issues at stake. I think on the one hand, let's talk about those who are opposing the idea of naturalization or giving Afghan refugees citizenship. This is a contentious and a political issue in the context of Pakistan. So let's look at how many Afghan refugees there are. There are probably, I mean, you might have a better idea. I think there are 1.5 million registered Afghan refugees, and they're considered to be far more Afghan refugees who are actually unregistered in Pakistan at the moment, right? That's not counting their children and their grandchildren. So for Pakistan, I think the one concern would be that should these citizens be naturalized, that then can have an impact in the demographic impact in certain cities such as Quetta and Karachi, where the ethnic balance is sort of there. You have a certain politics that's predicated on the ethnic makeup of these areas. And we also know that Karachi and Quetta Karachi is in fact the biggest sort of home to Pashtun refugees outside of Afghanistan. So there's that aspect to consider. I think it's also worth looking at some of the statements that have been made by the Ghani administration on refugees. So the Ghani administration is very keen to have these citizens return to Afghanistan as well. Because in Pakistan, many Afghan refugees who have come, they've been able to set up businesses, they've been able to contribute to the Pakistani economy. They've also been sending sort of money back home when they've been able to. And if these are skilled workers, for instance, there's a desire in Afghanistan that they be repatriated so that they can contribute to the Afghan workforce. So I think the desire for a dignified repatriation is a two-way street. Both sides actually want this to happen. The problem is that, again, this is very much conditional on some sort of conclusion to the conflict in Afghanistan. As long as Afghanistan remains on the boil and there's this low simmer conflict that occasionally becomes high simmer during fighting seasons, the question of their return becomes a lot more complicated because these families then don't really have a safe place to go back to where they can actually build lives and a livelihood for themselves. Again, one of the things that Pakistan has tried to do in recent years is also insulate its conversation with Afghanistan, the bilateral conversation about what the Pak-Afghan bilateral relationship looks like, from the larger question of the Afghan war, the Afghan conflict, what the US is trying to do in Afghanistan. I think there has been this very welcome realization that for things to move forward in the region, it's important that Pakistan and Afghanistan have a good working relationship. So in recent years, we've had a number of working groups come up, including on the issue of refugees, to talk exactly about this, to see what can be done to facilitate, and also to do this in a phased manner, because Pakistan doesn't want to be in a position where all refugees are, it has to send all refugees back. That would be very undignified. So I think working in tandem with Afghan authorities, but also with an eye to what the situation in Afghanistan on the ground is, Pakistan is going to try and look for a way to do exactly that. Try and repatriate Afghan refugees in a dignified manner, and take whatever steps that need to be taken in that regard.
I wish I shared your optimism for a dignified repatriation. I do think that much ado is made of the fact that we're talking about 1.5 registered refugees, potentially 0.9 million unregistered refugees. So max 2.5 million in a country of 200 million. That's 1% that we could give citizenship to. And also, you were talking about the remittances. So Afghanistan knows that it gets a lot of remittances from Afghans who are in Pakistan. And Pakistan also knows that it relies on Afghans for cheap and productive labor. And so maybe not enough is made of that. I kind of then wanted to, my last question is kind of looking at what happens next in terms of, you've talked a lot about the overall history of the conflict as well, like taking it back to before the peace agreement. So we saw that after the Soviets cut off aid to Kabul, the Najibullah government fell, and we saw endless civil war. And analysts today point to something of a stalemate of the same kind, which is to say that the Afghan government cannot defeat the Taliban, and the Taliban cannot cannot take Kabul. So what happens then? Are we going to see the same thing? I know that this is a very difficult question to answer, but I kind of just wanted your view on, are we going to see another forever war?
Yeah. I think one of the things that is of concern to all parties right now is that we may be headed towards an indefinite stalemate, which doesn't really favor any side ultimately. So I think it was in early 2021 that a report was released indicating that an estimated the Afghan government actually only controls 33% of all districts in Afghanistan right now. In comparison, the Taliban are controlling 19% of the total districts. The remaining districts, which is almost half of Afghanistan, are either fully or partially contested between both the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government. So in the comparative politics literature, what we call this is, we use this term monopoly of violence. And the Afghan government does not have a monopoly over violence and hasn't really had one since 2004. The problem here is that the Taliban doesn't need to have a monopoly over violence to be able to show that it's doing well. It just has to be able to indicate that the Afghan government, which claims to be the state, doesn't hold that monopoly. Right. And so this stalemate is very worrying. It's also worrying because we know that the Taliban have, a financial steady stream of revenue coming in. I think by some estimates, it's $1.5 billion a year that they're making through poppy cultivation, but also by taxing contractors, taxing highways, and taxing mineral deposits that fall under their purview. So they can keep this going. Earlier on we were having this conversation. One of the things that I mentioned was that both sides right now have been hounded to the negotiating table. So neither of them really has an incentive to be there. That's a problem. I think what will have to happen for negotiations to be able to move forward is that there'll have to be some sort of strategic rethink in both ends, where it actually becomes in their interest to be at the negotiating table, for them to see that yes, we will walk away from this negotiating table better off if we sign an agreement than if we were to leave the table without having signed an agreement. And that's really where I think the US also can play a better role in terms of how it sort of applies pressure on the Ghani administration to be more flexible and to compromise. I think other regional countries also have a role. So one of the things we talked about in Blinken's letter was the focus that has been placed on regional countries. So not just Pakistan, Russia, China, Iran, which we know do have contacts with the Taliban, which have leverage with the Taliban, can also play a role to try and bear pressure on the Taliban to say that, look, if you were to sign an agreement today, there you will be, not only will you be part of the political mainstream, but you'll get something that you didn't necessarily have before when you were last in power, which is you will have international legitimacy and recognition, provided, of course, that there are, of course, certain red lines, women's rights, letting girls go to school, letting women have all the opportunities that they've been afforded as a result of the post 2001 situation. if the Taliban agree to that and can also see that it's in their interest to lay down their arms, because right now I think that's the real sticking point. They believe that they can continue fighting, as does the Afghan government, which believes that it can continue fighting and wants to. A recent intelligence report is actually paints quite a pessimistic picture, because it suggests that should the United States withdraw from Afghanistan without a deal having been reached, there are places in Afghanistan, southern Afghanistan, Kandahar, Helmand, where the Taliban takeover is likely to be very swift. Afghanistan's police presence in those areas is patchy at best. And when operations did take place in 2020, the only way Afghanistan was able to retain control or partial control of certain districts was by relying on elite commandos and relying on the army. And there's this big question about whether that's sustainable. So this, again, coming back to the idea of the security framework, the security apparatus that's in place in Afghanistan, can that sort of survive a US withdrawal should the Americans withdraw?
Yeah. And I find it very interesting to have these conversations with people who aren't international lawyers, because then you find out the IR term. So the IR term for this is monopoly of violence. The international law term for this is effective control. And so the more we look at the Afghan conflict, and the more we look at the Taliban regaining territory or taking over territory, or even not regaining the territory, but seeing how the Afghan government does not have any kind of legitimacy or an ability to keep a stronghold in those areas, the more worrying it is, really, when you see the prospect for an endless civil war in Afghanistan. On that note, thank you so much for joining us today. This is such an interesting conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to everyone who's tuned in at home. We hope that you'll tune in for future podcasts. Thank you for joining us.